So again, I'm Steve Wolf, president and co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute. Welcome to this event and workshop. We're titled Recognizing Property and Ownership in Space. For those who aren't familiar with Beyond Earth, our mission is to establish and sustain a policy and legal framework that enables economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. If you'd like to find out more about our mission and our activities and what we're doing, I certainly encourage you to reach out to me. I'm going to leave my email in the chat field today. But about today's session, so during the session today, our panel of experts will engage in a discussion of what has been one of the longest running debates and most contentious issues that has occupied the space law community. The rights and or lack of rights of individual entities to make claims on territories or resources beyond the Earth's atmosphere. The challenge today for this topic, which has largely been an academic discussion among space law professionals, is about to become very real, very fast, as the private and public initiatives are gearing up to access the space resources on the moon, asteroids, and Mars. The space policy community has an obligation, we feel, to iron out a meaningful and enforceable set of protocols that all of us can follow in this regard, and not only create a level playing field, but one that will also facilitate the creation of robust new industries in space. This is the kind of issue that the Beyond Earth Institute as an organization seeks to address head on. We will not presume to have a definitive recommendation at this time, at least not yet, but we do want to engage in a fulsome discussion and engage in research on this topic. I have no doubt that today's program will generate valuable input that will move us forward in this regard. One note before I introduce our moderator today, Michelle Hanlon. For this session, we have allotted a full 2 hours. We have built in a great deal of time for the audience, for audience participation. So I really invite you to listen very carefully and vigorously add your questions and thoughts on this very critical topic. And now for our panel. I will briefly introduce Michelle first, and then I will let her briefly introduce her panel. Full bios for the panelists can be found on the Beyond Earth website. So Michelle, she is a co-director of the Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law and its Center for Air and Space Law. She's also co-founder for All Moon Kind, a nonprofit that is focused on protecting human cultural heritage in outer space. Michelle is also the current president of the National Space Society, great organization. So Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody. It's such a joy to see a lot of new names and faces, and also a lot of my students. So I know that our school year, our term just ended, and so my students are doing extra duty. So special welcome to you all for showing up. So yeah, I'm a professor of space law here at the University of Mississippi. I was talking, the idea for this particular webinar came about because there are so many organizations and so many individuals, and I see many of you out there thinking about how are we going to tackle this issue of owning property or having property or being able to do things in space without conflict that comes with things like territory and property. And so the concept we were thinking about was sort of trying to understand what was meant by the negotiators when they said province of all humankind, and where does that bring us today? And when we think about property in space, Michael brought up in some of our earlier discussions, space is infinite, and so we shouldn't have territorial disputes. And yet space is not infinite when we're talking about the space around us, the space on our moon, the space in our orbit, perhaps even the space on Mars. And so we really need to think about how we're going to prevent that conflict. It's much more about being able to explore and use and without that conflict. And so, when we think about sort of different regimes, we want to really go back in time and think about the fundamental concepts that we want to bring, not to just space, moon, resource utilization on the moon, not to just orbits, but just to every concept of this idea of ownership in space, whether it's ownership of a space object or ownership of resources that you've extracted or are extracting. And so we know that there are many, many different perspectives to bring to the table on this. Today, we only have brought 3, but we're really hoping to continue this conversation through 2022 and a bunch of different webinars styled like this one. And I did see, I see that Pete, you joined us, and I didn't know if you wanted to say a few words of introduction yourself, since you bring so much to the table with respect to resource extraction and utilization.
Sure. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. My sponsor that pays my bills was going out a little bit. But yes, this is a very important topic. I think that just in general, it's recognized that activities beyond Earth are going to require space resources, whether it's for fuel or for living on the moon or Mars or space settlements, space colonies, sort of O'Neill colonies and so forth. And as I think a lot of you know, this has been a topic of considerable interest. On one hand, the sort of 1980s and before agreements, I think don't really recognize that we're in this new phase of human activities beyond Earth orbit. It certainly doesn't recognize that commercial entities are going to be major players. I've been involved in this discussion for well over a decade and a half. As I think, as everybody knows, there's been a lot of activities in the United States, certainly. Now, I have been involved heavily in European activities. In fact, I'm now a Luxembourg resident, so I need to so I can't speak for the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, but I can speak as an advisor to them. Their interest in space resources began over a decade ago, and I guess I'm somewhat guilty of that. I was the director of NASA Ames at the time. Luxembourg is very interested in expanding their space activities. They had, as far back as the 80s, they had been a co-founder of or a sponsor of SES for communications. In the early this last decade, I was approached by the Minister of the Economy, soon to become the Deputy Prime Minister, who wanted to work with NASA over a series of discussions. We had, hit upon space resources, space mining, which interestingly was a long-standing, Luxembourg late in the 19th century became a kind of a huge economic power because of mining and manufacturing of steel mostly. Over the last decade, they set up a number of activities. There's really 5 pillars of them, and I think it's useful to kind of understand where they're coming from. The first pillar was a legal framework, and so they developed a law for Luxembourg, but also began to engage bilaterally with a lot of countries, and frankly made a lot of progress. Interestingly enough, Luxembourg can talk with China and Russia a lot more probably easily than the United States can. So they've actually made some progress there, although there's still controversy. Most of their progress has been made with I think European countries, but also with Japan, the United States, and a few others. They were approached as a result, I think, from NASA to be one of their first co-signatories of the Artemis Accords. But the first pillar is to really continue to develop that. They were a major sponsor of the Hague Working Group that came up with a set of principles that I think a lot of us are familiar with. They are now heavily engaged in further activities in that area. A second is they've pushed education, and they have a large program they've started at the University of Luxembourg. A third that they've developed funding, public-private partnerships for funding. there's a number of funds that they've set up, and recognizing that regardless, and by the way, space resources is just one element of this, but it's still the kind of the flagship area. But I think the funding is a major area. The fourth pillar is research, and they've worked with ESA to set up the European Center for Space Resources, ESRIC, and it is kicked off. It's also been arranged to be a early stage incubator for startups. And finally, they've worked a lot with public engagement in Luxembourg to kind of get the country on board. So I think it's important that to recognize that in some sense, where the U.S. is a leader in some of these, I think that Europe, and particularly Luxembourg, has been a major leader as well. And as we move forward, I think it's very important if we can, I know this is most of the people on here are certainly from U.S. perspectives, that if we can expand to include Luxembourg and European and others. Finally, I don't know where this will eventually go, but one of the things I know that some of the people I talk to in Europe are very interested in is there some sort of process akin to the World Radio Conference, the work for telecommunications, and of course Luxembourg is very familiar with that because SES was founded by them. So it's I think there's a lot of progress here, and I'd be happy to help in any way I can to put people in touch and work with Luxembourg, since I do live there most of the time. So.
Thanks so much, Pete. I think it's always an honor to have you join our conversation, because you have spent so much time thinking about it. I know a lot of people have, but your ability to help bring Luxembourg to the place where it is now, and I actually teach about Luxembourg and UAE, and look at these models of these small countries making big statements about and in space. And so again, thinking about property in space, we look at how again, there's this recognizing that there's this economy. And so that brings me back to this panel and what we were looking to get in this very foundational discussion about property were perspectives. And so I'm delighted to welcome Bob Brumley, who is the co-founder and chairman of Comstar Space Companies. And he very kindly wrote this scenario that I hope all of you have read for part of your homework for this session. But he's bringing sort of that exploitation. I don't like that word. I'd like to use utilization, and that concept, thinking about companies that are going to use the resources and sell those resources so that we can support communities beyond Earth. We also have Chris Morgan, who is a professor of public international law, including space law. He's co-director of the Center for International and Comparative Law at St. John's University in New York, and he has also done a lot of work with the Woomera Manual. And so we're going to tap into his understanding and expertise in public international law. And finally, we have Michael Waltmach, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Protestant Theology at Rover University in Germany. And we're teasing him as he's going to be our conscience on the call today. And so when we talk about what do we mean with respect to property and space, and what values do we bring when we use the word property? So what we've decided to do is I'm going to have both Chris and Michael, I should say all three of them, to talk a little about, give us sort of guide rails for the conversation today. They'll bring their own perspective, Chris and then Michael, and then Bob will bring his own perspective and then quickly share a summary of the scenario. And we will go straight into a discussion. Again, I want to reiterate what Steve said. We really want this to be a discussion. So if you have any questions as they come up, put them in the chat. We can go straight into a full-on discussion, or I can lead a discussion based on however passionate you all feel. So with that, thank you all again for joining us. And Chris, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And I'd like to begin first by thanking Steve and everyone at the Beyond Earth Institute for hosting this panel, for having this panel. I'd like to thank Michelle for organizing it, and Bob for writing the scenario that we'll be talking about at various points through the panel, and of course Michael for being on it with with all of us. So, so with that, what I would like to do for the next few minutes is really three things. The first is I'd like to unpack the question of this issue of ownership or property in space, to talk about that a little bit from the perspective of public international law and to a certain extent also from domestic regulation. The second thing I would like to do is to focus on one particular aspect of this, which is resource utilization or resource extraction. And it's really going to be by way of sort of an example of looking at how law tries to deal with a complex issue, but as we'll be talking about, it's not the only example of having to do with issues of ownership and property in space, but it's going to be really just to sort of tee up some of the issues. And then the last thing that I would like to do to close off is that my introductory comments is to talk a little bit about the role of law. That is, what does law have to do with these new endeavors that we're looking at? So along those lines, to begin with, the way that the question has been set up, it focus on words like property and ownership. A couple of other words that I want to mention are things actually, one thing that Michelle mentioned a few moments ago, which is use, and one other, which we'll be talking about, which is jurisdiction. Because all of these concepts are going to be interrelating to a certain extent, and at times sometimes popular perceptions might flow one into the other. Now, when we talk about sort of aspects of use or property in space, there are different things, there are different topics that we talk about. Sometimes, as Michelle had mentioned, we're talking about space objects. So a space station or a satellite, the interaction of the ownership of that physical entity, that physical vessel, with the regulatory responsibilities that exist, either of the company that owns it or of the state that has some type of regulatory responsibility over that space object. Another aspect that sometimes comes up in discussions having to do with ideas of use of space and finite resources is the allocation and use of orbits, especially of orbital slots that are geosynchronous. I'm not going to be focusing on this so much in my opening comments, but perhaps in our ongoing discussions, if that's something that people would like to talk about, we'll focus on that a little bit more. Then there's also resources from celestial bodies. That is what I will talk about a little bit. We can even talk about things having to do with debris and space junk and the ownership of space junk. But once again, that's something that might come up later in our conversation. So thinking about resources from celestial bodies and resource extraction, there are different ways that we've used resources or that we've extracted resources in the past. Sometimes it's for scientific study, the Apollo moon rocks. We're looking forward to in situ utilization of resources, perhaps using ice on the moon, on a moon base. And there's also resource extraction for commercial sale or use. So, mining asteroids or the moon for things that could then be sold to other private entities or public entities. This is what I'm going to focus on for the few moments that I have left in my opening comments. So the challenge here has to do with how do we regulate such extractive activities that are beyond national jurisdiction? There are different terms that have been used, such as issues of common heritage of mankind, also res communis, two different concepts having to do with resources that are beyond national jurisdiction. In res communis, it is something that is communal to all of humanity, but it would allow for national or private utilization. Common heritage of mankind, that idea looks more towards multilateral decisions as to how a resource would be used. Now, the issues here have to do in part with the sources of law that we have. And I have about 3 or 4 minutes left. And what I want to sort of posit is that essentially what we've seen is a dialogue that's been taking place over time and different sources of law. So as many of you would know, in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 2, it states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial objects, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty. So at one point, what we have is a core question of what does that mean? Does that prevent the use does that prevent, say, a company from mining the moon and then selling that? This has been, in part, a question of national interpretations of what a treaty responsibility is. So each signatory to that treaty will interpret what that meaning is. Now, as we know, in the Moon Agreement, in Article 11, it includes further language, which says that neither surface nor subsurface the surface nor the subsurface of the moon, nor any part thereof, nor natural resources in place, shall become the property of any state, international or intergovernmental or non-governmental organization. It goes on from there. So one of the issues is the language in Article 2 does language in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty go as far as that? Or should we view these as being two different things? This is something that I'll return to in the discussions afterwards. But I want to set this up as essentially a question of interpretation. Since then, what we've also seen is national activities. We've seen the US Space Resources Act in 2015, the Luxembourg Law in 2017, as well as attempts to try to sort of move the discussion forward in things like the Hague Working Group building blocks in 2020. These are attempts at the national level or at a sort of coordinating level to try to find ways in which there might be agreement. Now, for the last couple of minutes that I have left, what I'd like to mention are basically two things. First is that what we're seeing here are different modes of rulemaking, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. At times, states might use domestic laws. We have the laws in the US and Luxembourg and the UAE, but those have certain strengths and weaknesses. The strengths is that it's easy to regulate your own national entities. A weakness is that that is open to collateral attack. Other states might not agree with your view of property, and those could lead to attack in domestic courts in other countries in which they might not recognize the property rights that you have set up in your national laws. There's the issue of interpretation of, say, the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement and of customary international law. But interpretation is each state has an ability to interpret. But at the end of the day, it's the community of states that are parties to those treaties that ultimately will have the, pardon the pun, the gravity, the sort of the interpretational weight of where it goes. And that is in part where we are right now. We're in part in a robust discussion as to understanding what the how to understand Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. The Artemis Accords, I view as being an example of coordinated interpretation. The Artemis Accords, which itself is not viewed as the US as being a treaty, but what it does do, it shows that the signatories agree to a particular interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. So it sets up a sort of a community of interpretation that says we view this as, in similar ways to one another. Maybe not exactly the same way, but in similar ways. So this is part of the strategy of interpretation. Now, to close things off, to finish things off, let me just say a couple of quick words about the role of law. What I've discussed here are different things in terms of national law, international law, and some of the debates between them. In part, the role of law is to allow actors to order their affairs with a reasonable understanding of the future. That is, so that you could know that if you act in a certain way, your property, that you'll be viewed as having property rights, or that your contractual rights will be enforced. But the role of law is not just about contractual rights or property rights, it's also about equity. And one of the important things that we'll need to talk about, and then we'll talk about more, is this idea of the fairness and equity, both of the process of who is making the laws and how they're being made, and also the substance. So this is picking up in part from the writings of Professor Tom Frank, who's written a great deal about fairness and equity in international law. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we return to this and talk about different processes of making rules, and issues of fairness there, and then the substance of those rules. But that's really by way of just sort of teeing up a series of issues, and we'll sort of unpack them further as the discussion goes on. Thank you.
Chris, thanks a lot. It's sort of overwhelming, right? It's sort of like, whoa, and then we still have to discuss. I really sort of, what stuck out to me was honestly the fact that our scenario is in Australia, which has actually ratified the Moon Agreement, and what that means for the dynamic of understanding what will happen. This idea of different modes of rulemaking. And I would just add to, you're talking about this is the time we need to interpret Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. We also need to be interpreting Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. What does that concept of due regard mean? And I think really, as we tease out this concept of property and ownership, what we're really talking about is what does it mean to have due regard for something else, some other state or other person has said about either a piece of territory or a piece of rock. or whatever. And so finally, you closed with the concept of fairness and equity, which I think was a beautiful segue into Michael's comments to get us started off. So Michael, please.
Thank you. Okay, of course, I also want to thank everybody, but especially I'm terribly happy to be on this panel, and I will use the minutes I have to tell you why I'm not the right person to be on this panel to talk to you, and then tell you why I am the right person. So Michelle already mentioned that I'm a theologian. I've been interested in space exploration for 10 years now, and normally my thinking, my analysis, my research deals with human settlements, astrobiology, the question of life in space, right? Who are we in an infinite universe and things like that. So with the religious, philosophical, and ethical aspects of that, I'm interested in human culture in space and sending life outside the solar system, and that includes planetary protection. I'm also interested in the science fiction perspective. I learn a lot from that, and I've just seen that my friend Paul Levinson is on this call. Paul and I, we published a book together, Touching the Face of the Cosmos, on science fiction and stories and scholarly articles on religion and space exploration. So that is where I come from, and usually I'm not interested in property in space. I'm not even interested in uninhabited objects. And the first instance I realized that space law is really significant, apart from the great paper that we got that we're going to talk about today, was when Blue Origin decided to send a space lawyer to outer space. And to further that, they even sent the guy who played a lawyer in Boston Legal with her to outer space. So that's when I realized, oh boy, space law, that's a big thing. But here's the thing. When I read Bob's text, it struck me, bloody hell, that is very, very, very immediate and very scary. That scenario that he is painting with the Australian company and then the connection to the Canadians, and both signed the Artemis Accords and all those legal ramifications, I had not realized that this was so immediate. So the question for me immediately cropped up. We're talking about property and we're talking about financial values in that scenario. But what ethical values would we assign to things that are relevant for ethical debates and religious and philosophical assessments of space exploration in this regard? So I already told you, I used to have a problem with assigning value to uninhabited places. I thought we are life. Life is discovering the universe. We're doing science. We're doing planetary protection. We're protecting places that life can take hold there. Why would we protect uninhabited places? And one argument I understand is you can protect them for aesthetical reasons. Buzz Aldrin called it magnificent desolation on the moon, right? So the moon in its uninhabited glory has a certain value. You can also assign value by humans. You can call for a planetary park system that protects uninhabited places. But why should life assign value to non-life? For me, it sounds almost like a religious argument, like somebody made it to be uninhabited and this is the way it's supposed to stay. That would be a good value to assign if you did not want people to exploit or utilize resources on the moon. And then you can also assign value by comparing one use to other uses. You can say science first, exploration later, and exploitation last of all, right? And those would be solutions to deal with uninhabited places in the solar system in light of the scenario that Bob put to us. But regardless of value, what does this scenario that we are talking about today, what does that mean? From an ethical point of view, we ask the question, what values are at odds here? And regardless of what Chris just said about the legal ramifications, we saw the slide at the beginning, this is about utilizing resources. And this is about companies on planet Earth utilizing resources in outer space. This is not a romantic notion of homesteading. This is not the lone explorer who will go there and live his or her own life out on the surface of a moon and build his or her own life there. This is a company on Earth with shareholders trying to make money in an Earth setting. And that is something different than generating value in outer space. This is using space to generate value on Earth. Chris called that utilizing resources to sell, for instance. But there may be other means of value generation. You could do space power generation, or you could send IT infrastructure into outer space to lighten the loads that energy consumption puts on the Earth. And thereby you could maybe mitigate the effects of climate change. So by owning property or developing property in outer space, you could actually do something that helps the Earth. You could take this one value, that's one positive value of uninhabited or undeveloped outer space, and this other positive value of protecting Earth from the negative effects of certain industrial pollution, and play them against each other. So you could argue that there are good ethical cases for exploitation or for utilization and maybe even exploitation of outer space. And one argument I'd just like to put out there, and we're probably not going to talk about human settlement so much, but I've argued that a couple of times. When we look at humans in space, and the European Space Agency is proposing this Moon Village concept, and there's the Moon Village Association that thinks it's very important to think about culture on our way to a globally driven moon village. I would ask the question, if we talk about humans in space, what does human culture in space mean? And I find it interesting to note that on Earth, we distinguish culture as something that is not nature. There is nature, and then there's human change of nature, and that turns something into culture. All we create on Earth as culture is understood in relation to a nature that we can personally experience. I could just go outside and experience nature, in difference to the culture I'm just sitting in right now and using to talk to you. But if we go to the moon or to outer space, the nature that humans will be able to experience is already culture. You cannot experience outer space. You cannot experience the moon yourself. If you try to smell the smell of the moon, you will just die. And the moon does not smell. You need oxygen to make the moon smell, and you need oxygen to smell the smell of the moon. So my point is, if we go to outer space, what we will experience as nature is already human culture. And that makes it much more important that we talk about that development of culture now, because this is going to be our nature in outer space. And then maybe just one more point, and then I'll leave it open for discussion. I've learned so much by talking to you during the meetings before this debate. And one thing that I heard was a first come, first serve principle in gaining property in outer space, right? The first company that gets there, you've probably heard that, the first company that mines an asteroid, they will have such an advantage in technology, in resources. They will have a monopoly in outer space. So this first come, first serve ethics comes from emergency medicine, where it is embraced, or it is seen as positive, as it gives a certain random aspect to who gets treatment and who doesn't, right? Those people who can afford the faster ambulance do not necessarily get the treatment. Those who are closer, those who come first, get the treatment. But that does not apply in outer space, because in outer space, who comes first does not mean random, but who comes first in outer space means those are the people who have the resources right now and who can use those resources to go first. So in difference to what it means on Earth, the first come, first serve ethical principle would mean that those who already have will get even more in outer space. And I mean, I don't need to give you the examples for that. And that dials directly into what Chris finished with, how do we realize equity? How do we realize inclusion? And how do we realize, and I'm sorry, I'm German, I always keep missing this particular word, how do we realize proper representation of all of humanity in outer space? I don't need to point to For All Moonkind, who say proper representation of all humanity. If I understand you correctly, Michelle, means protecting heritage. But we can go from protecting heritage forward. How do we include all those nations that would now suffer under the first come, first serve ethical principles? And yeah, I think I'll just leave it with that. I've got a couple more interesting questions, but we will probably get to those in the debate. So again, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you, Michael. And added bonus, you mentioned For All Moonkind and protecting cultural heritage. Obviously, that's something very near and dear to me, and something really important, because I do believe protecting heritage also protects our universality and recognizes that we are humans and not necessarily just nationals of a certain country. Before I turn it over to Bob, I just want to sort of go back and blend what Chris and Michael said. When we think about, it was really important when Chris said that the role of the law is to help us understand the future, to give ourselves some stability in the future. And so that's not just for investors, but that's also for developing nations. You know, how do we deal with this first come, first serve? We want everybody to feel comfortable with the concept of whatever this regime is going to look like. And so I think the other thing I like to say about the law, though, is and I challenge people about this all the time, because Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty talks about sovereign states, and sovereign states cannot own territory in outer space, and therefore our entire property regime, which is based on sovereignty, doesn't apply in outer space. And I think this is a golden opportunity for people, for non-governmental entities, to really turn the concept of property on its head and think about it very differently. I don't know what that looks like, but hopefully we will get through some of those scenarios and thinking about that today. And so with that, Bob, I turn it over to you.
First of all, thank you very much, Michelle. And Michael, as an ethicist, I thought I might see you coming over to the dark side, just a little bit, on property. My role today is to be Bob the exploiter. And so the scenario that we've asked everyone to kind of do some homework on beforehand is really weaving in between what we have heard from Chris and what we have heard from Michael, is that these gaps that we have in terrestrial law, let's call it, these gaps create not necessarily impediments, but they also create opportunities for entrepreneurs and businesses who have the capital resources to exploit it. A little bit on how we got here is that it goes back really for me in 1988, when I was general counsel at the Commerce Department. I had one meeting with the science advisor, who was my counterpart at the legal advisor for the State Department, who was my counterpart at State, Abe Sophia. And we were finishing up the last Reagan initiatives before we were handing it over to the Bush administration. And in the area of space, of which Courtney Stadd also participated as a member of the Institute, we said, why don't we mark it that we return to the moon, that NASA returned to the moon. And in an offline, it was a discussion about the treaties. And Abe's concern was it takes so long to set standards relative to treaties that it would be difficult to put anything meaningful. So our concern was colonialism. I hear a lot of noise in the background, so I apologize for that. If we can get everybody on mute, that would be great. Our concern was colonialism, and very specifically colonialism as it related to what would be no sovereign authority, no jurisdiction, no rule of law, which allows one power with more resources than another power to actually go and exploit the resources of a third power. History is rife with that, and we don't need to go through colonialism, mercantilism, imperialism, communism, and capitalism. The point is, that's our history on this planet. And as a result, when you start moving off this planet, when humankind moves to something else, whether it be an asteroid or it be the moon, and ultimately to interplanetary and also to Mars, there is a motive associated with the development, and the private sector is interested in going there as well. So I came up with, at Michelle's request and Steve's request, what I would consider a credible scenario. And the credible scenario is what comes next. And I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to paraphrase, but go through these slides very quickly, because the case study can be read on this and also on the website. And we'll send these slides out afterwards. But the case study is intended to project what could happen within the next 4 years, not the next 40 years. And it's based on what would be capabilities that exist today. And it's very easy for us to look at, those of us who are in this industry, at lander capability, at extraction capability, at robotic capability, at software compute capability, and project how would that be performed or developed or run on the lunar surface, or around the moon, or in the cislunar area between the Earth and the moon. And is the technology there to do it? This case study is based on actual business cases of real companies that have this in mind to proceed with in the next 4 to 5 years. So the first slide, if you can go to it, that'd be great. This is storytelling. In January 1st, 2025, Koala II landed on the lunar surface in the vicinity of Shackleton Crater without incident. Shackleton Crater, for everyone's benefit, is in the South Pole. It also happens to be where pretty much every one of the science agencies have indicated a significant amount of, let's call it ice, frozen water. It's also where NASA has indicated that it will go, or actually stated within the last couple of months, it's where Artemis 3 is going to be located. Koala II is a lander. And so consequently, it was delivered into orbit by an insertion vehicle, WASP. There are WASP vehicles now, or vehicle insertion vehicles that have been developed, are capable of basically bringing landers to the lunar surface. Koala II's mission was deliver payloads for 2 commercial customers, Sutter's Mill Lunar Industries, which is an Australian company, and Lunarcoms Systems Limited, which is a UK company. They're also carrying, as they normally do, the landers carry civil science payloads for the Australian Space Agency. Landers are important because landers are leading the way. If we were looking at going to Asia from the United States, we would call them the black ships. They would be the ones that would be going to as far ends of the Earth, looking for commercial opportunities. In this case, the NASA CLIPS program is actually created a series of ships, satellites, if you will, landers, that will have the capability of landing on the lunar surface with multiple payloads to do multiple things, which, as they do those things, bring technology built on the Earth and interact with the lunar surface and below the surface. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, here we go. Very quickly, between January 1 and 9, 2025, it was deployed by Koala II. TT&C instructions were from Sutter's Mill, which means, in other words, they're essentially reporting back to the Satellite Operating Center in Adelaide. Each payload had a surface drone rover. Landers carry payloads, and the payloads do a multiple of functions. In this case, it was a drone rover, 10 kilograms in weight, respectively released by Koala II to move across the lunar surface to 4 distinct predetermined locations from the lander at a line of sight distance of 100 meters. Flat surface, drone rover, essentially imagine it crawling over the lunar surface. Have you seen other types of drones rovers do, not only on the lunar surface, but also on Mars? Each surface drone is equipped with a remote power umbilical, permitting them to rely on the lunar power source. Each had a remote drill and mix compartments, so they could do mineral extraction and evaluation down to a minimum depth of 60 centimeters, about 24 inches. Each drone had an extendable communications mast, like a composite material, almost like a cell tower, with an omnidirectional radio frequency antenna capable of achieving a height of 30 feet. It says 20 here, but it's 30 feet. The RF communication system is based on a design called an ORAN, Open Radio Area Network. It was owned and operated by Lunarcoms I, which transferred or relayed Sutter Mill mineral data out at the drone rovers to Koala II. And Koala II served as basically a node, a backhaul node, which then transferred and relayed data direct to Earth to both Sutter's Mill, Lunar Cons. That technology exists today. There are multiple companies that are actually doing what I just described here, or have business cases they, in the next 4 to 5 years, want to do exactly that. Telemetry tracking and control is the primary communications platform, giving details of the satellite's status, location, and actions. There are several new ventures that are looking at PNT platforms on the lunar surface to sort of serve as an augmented GPS system. They're commercial, as well as they have some government funding. Both UK, US, and other countries are dabbling in that. The Lunarcoms lease space on Sutter Mill drone rovers for its antenna in order to evaluate its proprietary operating architecture for Wolf. Wolf is the nickname for the ORAN. And then in October 2023, Lunarcoms File, and this is important, file its intention to broadcast on specific radio frequency bands with the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, via its national regulatory authority, Ofcom. Next slide. That's important because it's a notification requirement at the ITU. We talk about there's nowhere to go to get your ticket punched in the international institutions relative to the moon, but there is a place to go to inform, to avoid interference if you happen to be broadcasting or using spectrum, and that's the ITU. At the end of Koala II's 10-day mission at the crater, Sutter Mill and Lunarcoms deemed their respective missions a complete success. The deployment of the drone rover system performed per their design. Each drone rover operated for 70 hours. We all know lunar night and also battery life is a challenge with respect to landers. So everyone was happy with how everything performed. I'm paraphrasing now for time. Lunarcoms ORAN design and operating equipment, hardware, software had no outages or interference, permitting the use of its spectrum for demonstration for cloud services, meaning remote data management and support of Sutter Mill mining prospecting efforts. Finally, and this is important, prior to Koala II shutdown, Sutter's Mill and Lunarcoms were able to run an end-to-end data management demonstration, such as compute, which would be essentially managing the data that is managing the systems, permitting mining experts on the moon, on the Earth, to manage extraction and evaluation of lunar material via the ORAN, and then which would be the Wi-Fi network, and via what would be the direct-to-Earth Lunarcom hosted payload on Koala II, to determine essentially the efficacy of that operating system. That is important because that means you can remotely manage from the Earth's surface what would be robotic activity productively on the surface of the moon. In 2025, Koala II shut down. Next slide. Here is the resulting property claims from the mission. Sutter Mill, when it got back after detailed evaluation of its mineral data from Koala II mission, Sutter's Mill filed a mining claim with a variety of public Australian entities. One are public entities. Sutter's Mill, an Australian company, filed a notice with the Australian Space Agency, the Australian Communications and Media Agency, which is their version of the FCC or Ofcom, with instructions for each to notify the appropriate international department and agencies pursuant to any international agreements. In other words, I'm letting you know what I'm doing. You tell whoever you want to. Second, Sutter Mill also filed as an Australian company, registered in Adelaide with the Department of Energy and Mining, Government of South Australia, pursuant to the Mining Act of 1972. Sutter's Mill declared an intention under that act that its mining claim Based on its mining claim, it was going to file for a mining lease or an alternative, a retention lease, which is really a legislative requirement to develop their mining claim into something that would in fact be productive extraction of minerals or mineral development. They had to peg, well, part of it, the requirement is the property had to be surveyed and pegged. And so what Sutter Mill used to peg the location were its drone rovers as points, compass points. And it also used the Wolf network to essentially do what would be the P&T work that would qualify for a survey. They did find an approximately 26,000 square meter test area, a significant deposit of lunar ice. Next slide. Now the economics. The potential scale of the resource could exceed 10.5 billion gallons of liquid water, which would be sufficient to support both significant human habitation and also extensive industrial development like rocket fuel, hydro mining, turbine fuel, eco-agri. The claim value would be in the multi-trillions of Australian dollars with billions in investment to successfully exploit the resource, I should add in here, at scale. Consequently, Sutter's Mill claim was considered significant in the marketplace. The marketplace we're talking about here is venture capital, private equity, and debt financings. Sutter Mill made a preliminary mining decision to focus on the unnamed ravine on and about an area in the Shackleton crater, supported by data provided by the University of South Australia and previous NASA and ESA missions. So from a banker and an investor standpoint, you have validated the quantity, you've validated what would be the ability to extract and add value to it, and you have validated potentially what the demand might be. Sutter Mill prospecting area was over this tropical point and at 200 feet deep, 3,000 feet long, 2,000 feet wide. If you look at what is being estimated in the Shackleton area, these numbers are, there are a variety of different ravines, as we're referring to them, that sort of meet this kind of number. Then you look at, is it cheaper to bring water to the moon, or is the market really one where you actually would extract from the moon your water requirements? And this is not necessarily potable water for drinking. This is industrial use, and it turns out to be the economics by far support what would be development of water on the moon, as opposed to hauling it up there. Next slide. Lunarcoms. Prior to demonstration of the ORAN network performance, Lunarcoms had notified the ITU via its national regulatory authority, Ofcom, of its intent to broadcast on frequency bands in this specific location, in this specific period, for specific purpose on the lunar surface, as well as broadcasting direct to Earth. In addition to its notice of intention to broadcast on any and all these spectrum bands, it also advised the ITU of its intended use of this physical area for its service offering, which would include the general area near the Shackleton crater and a specific area of its ORAN infrastructure, which on Earth, we used to refer to these as circles of service or service areas. The notice of intent to use these physical areas denoting it as a service area, which had brought it into use prior to any others. Consequently, absent a clear licensing authority by the ITU for this service area, Lunarcoms claimed, quote, as Michael pointed out, quote, first to build, unquote, preference as a preference. The ITU accepted Lunarcoms filing with a bring into use date of 2029. That's what happens when you file at the ITU. They give you a certain number of years to actually develop it, and then you lose what would be your preference. Filing went on public notice, its intended spectrum of use. Today, not one request for coordination to avoid interference has been received by Ofcom and on Lunarcoms' behalf, which means they're bringing into use. Next slide. Their strategy to bring it into use was applicable here. Lunarcoms entered into agreement with a variety of telecom equipment manufacturers and software companies to design, build, and deploy its lunar ORAN, Wolf, across the service area encompassing the ravine, which is where the water is located. So what you have is, in shorthand, a Wi-Fi footprint over the top of this ravine to to bring what would be 5G, 6G capability to what would be a mining operation primarily on robotics that are managed with lunar compute as well as back to the Earth. Next slide. The next three slides, this last is the last slide. The international and private concerns that we're forecasting here is that when word got out about this, is that several international institution government agencies inquired essentially and expressed their opposition to it. Concerns that in shorthand, it possibly could violate the Artemis Accords. Commercial and investment interests began in earnest upon the publication of the mining data, and the subsequent claim and the demonstration of the Wi-Fi area, WOLF, could be established. In other words, creating stability, both in terms of product, in terms of output, in terms of service, commercial investment interest was validated. Finally, private industry openly opposed directly and through their national entities any government interference in lunar development in general and Sutter Mills mining claims specifically. This was originally written, this whole thing was originally written as a lawsuit. And the reason is that all great things in both the United States and Europe and other countries around the world always seems to end up in court, or else it ends up at the point of the bayonet. And in this case, we figured that setting this up as a lawsuit was interesting. My problem was, I didn't know which tribunal to put it in, because we once again as a group don't know who has jurisdiction. So the fine point here is that the question raised are implied by Chris's original comments. What law applies? What jurisdiction applies? Michael's comments about the ethics of doing this, who owns it, but not only who owns it, but how are we using it? Michelle's comments about the overall role that the international institutions play here. And mine, as Bob the exploiter, is that all of you can talk about this all you want, but the private sector is going to do it. And they're going to do it between now and 2025.
Bob, thank you. And thanks for this is, I feel like we could spend all of 2022 talking about all the various issues that your very realistic scenario raises. But I want to sort of, let's start from the beginning and think about, from your first question there was about international agreements. And, the moon is the province of all humankind. There's nothing wrong with what this company has done, right? There's nothing in our current law which says they shouldn't be there, they shouldn't be doing that. And when we're talking about why do they need to file these things, they're actually talking about protecting what they've done and protecting the work they've done, protecting their investment. And that goes all the way back into understanding this concept of property. What is the value? How do you value that in a fair and equitable way? And how does that fit into our current international legal structure? And I do always tell people, I tell my students, the Outer Space Treaty and the Outer Space Regime is built for lawyers because everything is so gray. We could argue about things for decades, and which is why it's so important that we have groups like this trying to figure out, not just for legislators and regulators, but also, honestly, I think if private companies could create their own code of conduct, that could be something, because as you said, Bob, they're going to do it. But if they have a code of conduct, then that code of conduct can become the basis for the law. So if we can convince companies to do it fairly and equitably and in a way that will allow, move us beyond first come, first serve, then maybe we found a good pathway. So Chris, I wanted to go back to you because you brought us into this concept of sort of law is understanding the future and the idea of, using the ITU model. Pete Worden brought up the ITU model as a basis for how we do this. I mean, honestly, these companies are going and they're going to do this. Why don't we just let them figure it out on their own?
So I thank you for that question, Michelle. So to maybe set out a couple of tease out a couple of threads here and also come back to Bob's point about sort of courts and so on. The first is one thing that I think that we need to separate out is the idea of national territory versus private property. Those are two different concepts, and I think that they get sort of mixed up sometimes in some of the discussions. The issue of national territory, that is, say, what is the territory of the United States or what is the territory of France or what have you, is, and how does the US change its territory, its sovereign territory, France change its sovereign territory, is something that is very much in the framework of public international law. And in terms of changes of sovereign territory, we look at things such as occupation, extension of showing an intent of holding something as a sovereign, operation of treaties sometimes where territory is moved by operation of treaty. I mention this because at the core of the public international law debate is whether Outer Space Treaty Article 2 is specifically about that no state shall extend sovereignty over, say, part of the moon. Whether it is just about that, or whether it is also about whether no company can utilize moon resources as private property. And that is sort of a fundamental, so that's a sort of fundamental split in terms of thinking about this. Now, there is actually an aspect in terms of whether how the private property aspect also relates to national sovereignty. I'm going to come to that in just a moment. But the US's view and the view of various other countries is that it is by private entities on the moon is not an extension of U.S. national sovereignty. It has that written into the 2015 Act. It puts in a specific point that says this is not an extension of national sovereignty. But other states disagree, and the disagreement is this: it says that if any country licenses its companies to be able to go and utilize resources, then what that country is doing is it's basically establishing a certain sovereign jurisdiction and saying that it can make rules that would apply in an area that is beyond its national territory. So that's the view that certain countries have, and this is where you get the debates over the interpretation of Article 2. Now, a few moments ago, Michelle, you'd said something along the lines of that what these companies are doing is sort of, it's just using stuff, and it's a question in terms of protecting what they're doing there. So that is the thing that there would be disagreement with, because there are those who would say, if we take the idea that it's the common heritage of mankind or common heritage of humanity, that it cannot be by operation of national decision making that there's utilization, but it has to be through multilateral decision making. Through other theories, the res communis view, there would be the view that even though it is something that's common, there can be utilization. Now, we can look to analogies in terrestrial law in this, and we can take two analogies looking from the law of the sea. The treatment of say fish in the high seas it's viewed like res communis, that states can go out and have fishing fleets that will fish from the high seas, that is not in any way an extension of sovereignty, but that is something that is allowed. There's been a lot of debate over subsoil resources in the deep seabed, which has evolved over time, but at the initial time, that the argument that was used there was sort of the strong version of the common heritage of mankind argument, which was that this should be through some type of multilateral agreement. So all of this is to say that, we have here an issue of at times speaking past each other. The US is saying, and other countries are saying, we're not establishing territorial sovereignty over celestial resources. Some countries view that that there's an aspect of that, and that's a fundamental disagreement. That's something that needs to be discussed. The issue of private property, and I'll sort of finish up with just a couple of points here. The issue of private property is very interesting, is that the rules that we tend to have in private property tend to be national rules. So in the scenario that Bob was describing, who was it describing? Australia's techniques for understanding mining rights. Now, other countries might say, that's nice if those are the rules that Australia had, but Australia doesn't have the ability to apply those beyond its national jurisdiction on the moon. That would be the argument. And they would point to various canons of construction, which is that we assume that rules are not meant to be applied extraterritorially, outside of a state's sovereignty. Regardless of that, another country doesn't specifically have to accept the technique, the procedure that Australia has used. They could say, well, that's nice that that's the technique that Australia uses, but we should come up with one so that we all agree, since we're all going to the moon, or there are a variety of countries that are going to the moon. So that sort of debate amongst national views is why the sort of international coordination is so important, because we do not, here I'm speaking personally, first come, first served is, I think, is a problematic result, because I think it is, I don't think it is stable. Going back to the issues of equity that we were talking about before. Others will disagree. That is, other countries will disagree about how any one country acts. So it's important to have a process where there's some type of general agreement. The last 2 points I want to say on this is the importance of having a process where there's an international understanding of how we will utilize resources is important, because we talk a lot about the importance of sustainability of space activities. Related to that, it's important to have sustainability of the rules. If the rules themselves are not sustainable, if they are attacked, if they are ignored, then the advantages that we were talking about before, and these are advantages for companies, for private citizens, developed, lesser developed world, all of it, the advantages in terms of certainty of action will be gone. So it is important to find rules that are generally agreed upon so that we can have the sustainability of the rules themselves. Last point on the issue of which court. So very briefly, if this was a state-to-state dispute, there is a chance that it would be in front of the International Court of Justice. There are a lot of rules having to do with jurisdiction in front of the ICJ, and the question is whether it would pass one of those jurisdictional hurdles. But state-to-state disputes are between the ICJ, would be likely in front of the ICJ. There can also be state-to-state disputes or disputes with private actors that would likely be in international arbitration. And there would less likely be in front of a national court, but more likely in front of an agreed upon arbitrator or panel of arbitrators. We can talk more about that at another point. But for any of this, if there's disagreement over, say, how one state has decided to say that is property that can be brought back to Earth, and that our company should be able to sell that, other states might not agree, and other states might attack those contracts collaterally in their courts, and it could lead to the value of the property assumes that there would be agreed upon title to the property, and we've seen for a variety of different things where states choose to regulate to not allow the sale of certain things, and that that collateral attack would change, I think, the economic calculus. So to Bob's last point of they're going to go, I think it assumes a certain level of certainty of property rights and of contractual rights. And well, as a lawyer, that's the interesting part right now, is that's what we're trying to figure out.
Chris, I love the concept of sustainable laws. I haven't really thought about it that way. And, we're talking so much about sustainable development. The foundational to that are the implementation and development of sustainable laws. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because the chat's going back and forth, thinking about somebody, I think it was Claire, suggested well, maybe the entire moon should be a heritage site and we should be looking at it very differently. And Michael, you talked about values, and you talked about how we assign different values to things. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, the two comments that I'm thinking about are the one that said, hey, we should make the moon a heritage site and protect it, the whole moon, not just the boot print, not just where the cultural heritage is. And then the counter argument from I think Michael was, well, if we do that, it's going to make it very difficult for humans to explore space. And we need to explore space for a lot of reasons that are not the topic of this conversation. But how do you balance those values? Explore and settle space. Thank you, Michael.
First, let me say before I forget, Chris, that the sustainability of the law, I would think that's a great argument against the first come, first serve ethical principle. So I'm proposing that there is a direct inverse relation between the sustainability of any law in outer space and the time between the first and the second person who wants to utilize resources. The closer you lose, the more you're willing to go against the law. And that would probably mean that the law will not be sustainable if there's no regular enforcement. So this first come, first serve principle in itself might threaten any law that we have for outer space resource utilization. Just saying, it's not ethically, not only ethically problematical because it's not random in outer space, but also because it directly threatens the law and turns everything into into sort of a almost warlike situation. And then to what you just asked, Michelle, it's complicated. I mean, I read Claire's comment that for maybe the whole moon should be protected for spiritual reasons, right? And we know those stories from the Apollo days that the Apollo astronauts were let's say confronted with the view that they had stepped on holy ground, literally on holy ground. And for them, that was a big surprise. But there may be people who can perceive, and there are religions who perceive the moon as a holy site. That would make actually not a bad argument for protecting the whole moon from something, right? You don't want people to drill for oil in a sacred site of your own personal religion, and we have those cases on Earth. So that would be a good argument. And how would you go against that? And I see Michael's point saying if the entire moon is designated a heritage site, that makes space resource utilization extremely difficult or financially unfeasible. So I would say it all goes back to what I was trying to state. And actually in the chat, then there's an argument, if there's no capitalism in space, then nothing will ever happen. I don't think it's so much about systems like capitalism. I think it's about systems of value exchange. If you say there is a value attached to the whole moon that is spiritual or for heritage protection or for the aesthetics of it, we don't want any solar panels in magnificent desolation that would, or you probably remember those from the 60s. They're going to paint the moon red and write Coca-Cola on it. That was a common joke in Germany. We don't want advertisements on the surface of the moon. So aesthetical reasons, we assign value like that. And then on the other hand, people want to utilize the resources. And yet you have to ask the question, for what? Is it for a financial gain of a very, very small group of people? Or is it gain for all of humanity? Can we take industry of Earth and plant it in outer space where it will help us live a more sustainable life in balance with our nature here on Earth? And then you could say, okay, this value trumps the other value, and we're going to find a balance between that. So I think as long as we're talking about not only equity, but about a balance between values and about people, a balance between people involved and people who benefit from that, I think we can find a point where both those values can be can be related to each other. Ethical decisions only come up if positive values are in conflict with each other, right? If you have and that's maybe a capitalism argument. If you have a factory that doesn't produce anything good, only pollutes nature and doesn't give you any revenue, why would you keep it? There is no ethical problem there. Shut the thing down and be done with it. But if it produces something really, really good and also pollutes nature, then you have the ethical problem. And maybe we can just avoid that problem in that regard. If we, for instance, so I have a colleague who suggested, or what he did was he compared space resource utilization to nuclear energy production. And in Germany, you all know we've gone out of that, right? We have this public or political decision. We will shut all our nuclear reactors down. And now somebody has to bear the cost of shutting those reactors down. And society, the taxpayer, has to bear those costs. And so he compared space resource utilization to that and basically suggested we have the problem of paying for energy industries fault now. So why don't we tax, pardon my French, the heck out of the space industry beforehand, save the money, and then solve the problems that they created. So taxation is the solution. I don't necessarily think it's a smart solution, but at least what he's trying to point out, or if you want to phrase that positively, what you can try to point out is that as long as not the whole society benefits from it, there will always be doubt about the value of that enterprise. So I think that will be a logical solution, to go say, find some positive value to attach to it and then balance other positive values out.
Thank you, Michael. Bob, I'm curious about what your thoughts are about what Michael said and about this concept of finding these values. And I think one thing that I was thinking about, as Michael was saying, is what if the company actually is required? Like, what if you manage to find something that is really beneficial to humankind, maybe some sort of mineral or something, and then, but it's not financially viable, and then humankind demands that the company keep producing it. I mean, I think that it can go both ways. But your comments, please.
Yeah, I've enjoyed both Chris and Michael's points of view. Let me kind of go to the big inherent problem here is not just American industry, European industry, Asian industry, Australian, et cetera. Everybody wants to go to space. Morgan Stanley is estimating, which I think now they've actually been able to prove, it's $1 trillion economy. Most of that is in LEO, low Earth orbit. But you know, $1 trillion is a lot. And if you allocate 10 to 15% of that $1 trillion market to the moon, where there is nothing right now, that's a big number. And that's a big number that's attracting a lot of creative people who are looking at the moon as in a positive, in an ethical way, as well as in a legal way, but they are doing what humankind has done forever. And that is expanded out, if you will, to provide for themselves, their families, their nations, et cetera. So the theoretical and also the ethical and then also the institutional issues are interesting, but to a certain degree, applying some of the thoughts that Chris had with respect to sovereign territory and how sustainable law can be, you only have to go as far as the South China Sea and say, well, it depends on how big you are and how much of a bully you are. Because you can go pour cement and create a runway in the South China Sea, and now you've created new land that didn't exist before, except a coral reef, and you can claim it's sovereign territory. If you can do that now, even though the courts have gotten involved in it, you look now offshore, off planet, and I don't think the behavioral factor is going to change anything. I think what people are going to want to do is they're going to want to basically expand industry and industrial development where there are markets, where there are buyers, where there is consumption, there is the ability to do things. So a lighter touch would be to try to regulate it. Michael, that's taxing. Regulation is okay because businesses can pass that along to the customer. They can try and tax it. They can regulate it. They can bring some safety to it. Some regulations relative to how things are done, which includes environmental. Well, it'd been nice to have environmental regs before we had a coal industry. Now we have a coal industry. Now we wrecks. So there's ways to do this, but the reason all these things are being done is because you have no ability to stop it. So my point here is, let's go back to the case study. How are you going to stop that? Someone's got to complain to Australia, right? Because Australia is in fact that's the international member state that gave a license to WASP to take the lander up there. They have a launch license. They got it through the Australian Communications and Media Organization, which filed notice to, I'm presuming, with the ITU. So Australia is the sponsor state. So to stop further activity like this, Australia would have to turn to its industry and say, I'm not giving you a license not to do that. Or what, and I plead ignorance on this, and it may be true, it may not be true, but my gut tells me on the NASA CLIPS program, I don't know how much NASA is looking at what the payloads are going to do on the CLIPS landers. I think NASA it's a fabulous program. I have nothing but positive to say about it, but I don't know if NASA goes, I want to see your passenger list. And I want to look at what's that guy going to do, and that guy going to do, and that guy going to do. Because does NASA have a veto of astrobotics or intuitive machines or Maston to say, you can't take them to do that? Now that would be a regulatory reach into managing what would be this transition. And I don't think that's happening. I think NASA takes payloads on these landers, and then the commercial guys get to put whatever payload they want, who will pay the freight to get up there. So through everyone's comments, both sides, Chris and Michael, is I hear the concerns. What is the remedy? What are the sanctions? How can you stop it? And I think you can't stop it. I think you have to basically manage it. In the international community, like I'm kind of full circle to Abe Sophia and we just said, kick it to the Bush administration. It's their problem now. So to a certain degree, it's, I don't know, who do you kick it to? Because there was nobody going to the moon in 1988, 89, but they are now, and everyone's kind of late on this internationally. But like I said before, the case study is based on real companies that have real business cases to do this exact same thing in the same time frame we're talking about. So the immediacy here is one where, you know, the salons in Brussels and The Hague are going to have to deal with this fast, and there's going to be some venue shopping. Just as Pete mentioned, I'm inclined to suggest to people scamper over to Luxembourg, because Luxembourg's a member state with a strong promotional feel about wanting to do, resource development on the lunar surface. They may belong to Artemis, but what happens if NASA tells Luxembourg, behave yourself, or else you're out of the Artemis Accords? I don't ever see that happening. So as this all goes back and forth, people are making landers, people are booking payloads, people are booking launch times, and people are filing with the ITU and going to the moon. So now, just for the sake of everybody out there, today my role to play is Bob the Exploiter. So I really do like puppies, and I do believe in the rule of law, but I can tell you what, I'm being very polite in when you're dealing with investment bankers, finance guys. How are you going to make your money? You first to market. That, by the way, Michael, is bring into use first. Get there, you're first to market. That's an enhanced value proposition when you're raising capital. That gives you what we all want, a monopoly for a certain period of time. And if you can get a monopoly on the moon, it has value and allows you to raise your money. So I don't have any, I wrote that with the only known answer I have. Human behavior and capital chase each other, and they kind of run side by side. And that's what's happening here. The international institutions, I think, are late to this, and they need to catch up.
So again, a lot to unpack there. I did Gordon Russell bringing up the tardigrades, because you're very right. I mean, the FAA is not spending a lot of time looking at the payloads that are going to the moon, and they don't have any guidance from the U.S. Congress about what should and shouldn't be going to the moon at this point. And one of the things I worry about is, in the United States often jokes that Canada is our attic, right? But we don't want to make the moon the world's attic. We don't want to keep sending diplomas and pieces of hair and tardigrades and so forth there. Although again, looking at the value, if you look at a company like Astrobotic, that's how they're making the money in order to fund themselves to be able to get to the moon in the first place. So, you know, what is the trade-off there? I think you talking about the South China Seas and this licensing and this regulatory process. I'm going to throw this back to Chris because the public international law aspect of it, but you know, to me, that's a big struggle because for all mankind, we passed the One Small Step Act, which was hugely diluted from what we wanted it to be. But right now, at least we have one country in the world that says, if you are doing work with NASA, don't go near the Apollo lunar landing sites. So how do we translate that into the international community agreeing that we ought to protect, identify and protect sites on the moon? So how do we take these regulatory processes? So we have, you know, the US has the most robust licensing process in the world, and still things slip through. We saw that with the tardigrades, we saw that with Swarm. If we, you know, how do we get that to translate onto an international level? What would you say, you know, in these failures that we've seen, like this in the South China Seas? What is the next step to reach that international custom or agreement?
That's a great and very complex question, Michelle. But to pick up with that in terms of what Bob was saying, so Bob, just in terms of one thing that you were saying in terms of how do we stop it, or if I mean, one thing is keep in mind that that's not an argument that I'm making in terms of stopping it. The question I've been posing is what does sustainable regulation look like? I haven't posited any specific answers as of yet, but I'll mention a couple of things in relation to what Michelle was saying. But I don't think it's a question in terms of stopping exploration of the moon. I don't think realistically it's sort of stopping, you know, looking towards utilization of resources on the moon or on other celestial bodies. But I do think there's this question of what sustainable regulation would look like. And that's, I think, at the heart of Michelle's question. And the reason I think it's an important one is for, in part because I think some of the things that you've been describing still has an assumption underneath, which is that there will be economic value to doing this. So the other side of that is that regulators can compete and try to do things that will undermine economic value, trade wars, essentially. And if you have a variety of states that are seeking to utilize resources on, let's say that there's an asteroid that's found in which there's, say, a large amount of titanium on it, and one state's companies goes and it starts to mine it, and then other states start to do that as well. That first state's company might say, no, according to my state's regulators, I have the right to all of this use. And the other states could say, no, you don't. We don't recognize the decisions made by your country that was to your benefit. Our countries say that we could do that. That's the idea of international law of recognition of administrative decisions and of judgments of each other. So this goes back to this idea that, as I was saying before, that what we have here is a very complex discussion amongst regulators. They might be behind the game, you know, behind a little bit, but part of it is that they all have their interests in part of their own states involved. And that there could be a lot of disruption that can come from this. Early on, we made a mention of sort of like states either sort of, you know, where there are disputes, it might go to court or go to war. I think the range of activities is much broader than that. And I think what we see here is regulatory competition. And part of the challenge is maybe going beyond regulatory competition, but finding a way for some type of agreed upon set of how we do things. That's not saying that we should use specifically the ITU model. But the ITU model is an example of an attempt to do that, to manage a finite resource, radio frequencies, so that there is a minimization of harmful interference. Not saying that it works or it's perfect or anything like that. All I'm saying is that it's an attempt towards that. So things that we see, like in the Hague Working Group, talks about things like setting up an international registry, so that there would, if we can have an agreed upon way in which we would accept each other's claims, that would potentially deconflict a certain amount of the process. And other suggestions that are there in terms of the Hague Working Group, which are really meant just as stepping stones for the discussion, ways to start those discussions. So I guess in short, I think that we're all talking around the same issue, which is, generally speaking, economic activity moves faster than regulatory activity. There's nothing new to that. But the question that we have is there a form of sustainable regulatory activity in which we would get to results in which there would be general agreement in terms of this is how this process will move forward? There are some suggestions from the Hague Working Group. There's examples that we could look to from the ITU, from the Law of the Sea, different types of examples, sometimes that go crossways. But I do think that is the discussion that's taking place now. And I want to maybe underline that aspect that I was mentioning a couple moments ago of recognition, which is that the states themselves are competing, and the states don't necessarily have to recognize the claims by each other's actors. So you want to find a way to try to resolve that in a way to decrease the conflict and increase the sustainability of the rules. And keeping in mind all of the other things I mentioned as well in terms of the broader issues that we have of equity. And by the way, I should say, Michael, I think that this doesn't completely resolve the issue of first come, first serve, but it's right now it's a process of talking about processes, and even the ITU, which is technically used a sort of first come, first serve technique, has been trying to get away from that and find way in focusing on things of radio frequencies and satellite allotments as being finite resources and thinking about how to manage it. And it's been an area that's been particularly criticized recently by various satellite launching states looking at mega constellations, which at the moment have been primarily coming from the US, and concerns in relation to that. So that's sort of, amongst sort of the spacefaring states, that's an area of argument as well.
So I'm gonna quickly answer Scott, because I did write that Article 2 gives us incredible flexibility. I really honestly, Scott, I see a framework, and I think I haven't read what Michael was referring to, but I see a framework created by the people and the entities that are actually there, because we've been talking about enforcement, we've been talking about the fact that whoever's there is going to be there. How are you going to stop them? And I think what we need to do, what I like to say, I'm so grateful to see 60 plus people on this call, because it's really our responsibility to get this right for our future. And so, to understand that we are struggling with this is both sort of like a pinch yourself moment, like, wow, we are on the cusp of something really amazing. But we have such incredible responsibility to the next generations to get this right. And so in my view, it's not a heavy-handed regulation at a national or international level. It's giving, guardrails, I like to call them, to the entities that are going to get there, and give them the tools they need to make the rules that we need to see, and to guarantee that equity and that fairness. And I don't know beyond that where that goes, and that's sort of the focus of my research. I'm going to get back also to Leo, but Michael, you have your hand up, and I know you and Claire have been in quite a chat. So please go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to go back to the regulation conversation, and specifically even the mention of the ITU, and a caution that, in a lot of these conversations I've had over the years. Yeah, I'm dark in my basement. You can't see me if I start my videos. Going back to the internet, when it started in 1993, when the law was passed or changed that allowed commercial speech on the internet, and right around the time that Al Gore was talking about the information superhighway, there was an effort within Europe to create something like that. It was based on a level of set of protocols that were designed by ITU subcommittees. None of that ever saw the light of day because it was overly bureaucratic. took far too long. And the Clinton administration made the intelligent decision that this was an area where regulators had absolutely no basis of understanding what the regulations should look like, and that they should butt out until and unless an actual problem was demonstrated to exist, and then you solve that problem. Because at the time, the suggestion was that the internet be governed by the ITU and be run by the cable companies. If that had actually happened, we would not be talking like this right now. And so there is a strong instinct, that occurs in a lot of these conversations, that space is somehow a tabula rasa on which I get to write the fever dreams of my view of what society in space will look like, when we really don't know. And the people that are going to write the rules for how things are regulated in space are going to be the people who actually go there. And the idea that we understand enough of the problems now that will occur is, I think, a little intellectually specious that we have that much information. Whenever I speak to people on the Hill, or even, people with the title of space international lawyer, reasoning based on bad science fiction TV shows as references for what may or may not happen in space, we do not know enough. And I would strongly encourage that when we talk about regulation, it's regulation based on actual harms and actual problems that have shown to exist, not ones that we can imagine. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I feel like you took a page out of my space ethics and the hard question of, what's it going to be like? I mean, the one thing, Michael's right. We don't know. We don't know what it's going to be like for our future generations to wake up and see the Earth out their window instead of the moon out their window, or to not see anything out their window. We don't know how they're going to react, how that's going to change how we interact with each other. But I want to go to Michael and sort of to respond to that. And I also would like to sort of we have about 20 minutes left. We've been talking about resource utilization. Chris brought up orbit. We've talked about constellations. And to Michael's point, don't regulate until you see there's a problem. Well, are we starting to see a problem with constellations? And we have now Starlink coming with 40,000. I'm sure I'm getting the numbers wrong, but we also know we have China suggesting that they're going to have 40,000, and Rwanda just put in a license for 350,000. So again, throwing it back to you in terms of value and how are we going to deal with deciding who gets to have their mega constellation orbit, because we certainly cannot sustain all of them, and certainly astronomers, for example, are saying we already can't see well enough to see when that asteroid is going to be on its way and hit our planet.
Thanks, Michelle. Let me read something to you that I just wrote down a couple of minutes ago. It says here on this page, express surprise how finite and limited the infinite resources of space are. Because that is something that I've heard a couple of times now. And Michael, that is probably one of the reasons why it's so easy to miscalculate in prognosing. What's the word? Do you prognose the future? Do you
prognosticate?
Prognosticate. A German would prognose the future. So I prognosticate it because I'm not speaking to German. We think of it as infinite, right? And it's so clearly not. So there's orbits, there's only this area around Shackleton crater where we want the water, where there's the sun, and so on and so forth. So we are basically extrapolating resource problems that we have on Earth into outer space, and we find that they are the same out there as well. That's the one thing. The other thing is, I wasn't really convinced about my colleagues' suggestion of taxing people beforehand, but somebody in the chat pointed out that taxation could be used. And I'm just putting that out hypothetically, right? Because I know about the state of the German Autobahn. I know that taxation could be used. It is not, to build infrastructure. So if we assign value to something in space exploration that is currently not there, infrastructure, we might solve one of those problems. And then we get to another problem, the mega constellations. I have a friend who used to give presentations in which he pointed out that what do you want from your tax dollars that go to space exploration? Do you want civil servants planting flags, or do you want space infrastructure? And then he had some brilliant examples. And I've already used one of those, solar power from outer space, mitigating, for instance, coal power, and thereby mitigating climate change on Earth. So building infrastructure, maybe not through taxation, but maybe through private corporations exploring space and realizing that it's in their best interest to build infrastructure, the space elevator or something like that. I'm a theologian. I don't even know if that is feasible. I understand that that the physics behind it is sound, but the material science seems to be lacking in that regard. But maybe if we throw enough money at it, it'll work. That would be a great piece of infrastructure that would solve a lot of problems, right? On the other hand, there's these mega constellations. They are infrastructure. And of course, they bring the internet to areas of the world that does not have the internet, so that people who can't look at cat videos can now look at cat videos. But I'm just kidding. Maybe help with emergency calls, emergency services, and so on and so forth. So that is a positive value. Of course it is. And then there's the problem that we are basically blocking a lot of orbital real estate that we have with those mega constellations. We have the problem of space debris. We have the problem of collisions in orbits. And I'm pretty sure that with the world being, or the space world being aware of the problem of space debris, you can mitigate those problems for the mega constellations. Those will not be in orbits that will endanger other satellites and so on and so forth. So there probably is ways around that. And then there's astronomers who say that they can't see the stars the way they used to be. But then on the other hand, if you live in New York City, but even in my city or in Germany, you can't see the stars the way they used to be. So maybe that's not that much of a problem. I'm just hypothetically thinking about it. Personally, I think that space infrastructure in that regard also needs to reflect on how it interferes with Earth life. But as far as I know, Elon Musk with his Starlink trains has done that. They found a way to turn them at least darker than they used to be. So they made the problem smaller than that. But I'm not sure about it. I'm still thinking about this problem of yeah, maybe Bob put it too sharply, Bob the exploiter. Maybe it's not about exploitation. Maybe utilization is about creating an economy, and I think that is something that I would think would have a value in itself. Creating an economy off Earth that does benefit Earth, does benefit people on Earth. Michael Mealy has pointed that out in the chat, that if there is nobody who wants to give money for that, there will be no corporations going there. So there's a balance problem too. But maybe an industry off Earth will also create infrastructure that then benefits the whole Earth. So that is the thing I take from this. Maybe creation of infrastructure as a beneficial tool to create a value that adds to the value debate and counters out some of the negative values we've talked about. That does not completely solve the problem of, for instance, protecting the moon. But at least by building infrastructure, you, don't get me wrong, you destroy it in the way that leaves something positive. Let's put it that way, for lack of better words. Thanks.
Go ahead, Bob.
the point you make is really the point. You've got you have not an extreme case, you have a really verifiable case in the business case. As I pointed out, every one of those business activities there is already underway by companies, and those companies are raising money, getting insurance, putting money down. They have business cases for an after product and that sort of thing. But what I think is really interesting here, which I'll open the door for moving from exploitation to husbandry, is you got to have an ecosystem to succeed. Otherwise, one of the things about this case study, one lander, 4 probes, some decent material, good communications, but notice that Sutter Mill wants to license their mining claim to someone else, someone big like Rio Tinto or BHP or one of these big mining companies we have on Earth. Those companies have the capital and the ability to actually blow that out, that opportunity out into something scalable. That requires an ecosystem. It requires lots of landers, requires lots of below ground activity, requires some really good engineering to solve lunar night and essentially what are all the harsh environmental areas. And that's a lot of the implication in that case study. That, remember, Koala shut down after 10 days and that was it. So the companies that exploit that or develop it, I should say, are the prospectors. And then the prospectors flip it to what would be the ones who build the ecosystem. And I'm going to answer my pregnant question I asked earlier. How do you deal with this? You deal with this on an orderly way of developing the ecosystem. You let the entrepreneurs get out there. You let them take the risk. You let them do what Koala and others are doing. But then when the large companies come in, because then, Michael, that's when you run the risk of destroying whole sections of what would be the moon or something else. Then you want to make sure that there is some rational regulation on how they proceed. And I think that, to me, is the answer. The answer isn't you don't get a launch license. The answer is let them do what they do because it's so small scale. But when it starts to scale, there's a national obligation as a member state to regulate it. And then that member state will have to go in our economy. Australia may be doing this, but it may be a Canadian company that buys the mining claim. And it may be a Brit company, a UK company that finances it. And it may be a Canadian EDC, Economic Development Corporation, that provides the essentially the debt financing for it. It's internationalized just by capital. And so if you've internationalized the ecosystem, it's a lot easier to regulate it. And I use regulation in a reasonable sense. I know Michael's was mentioning the dirty word regulation, but and I agree with him. I come out of a political background that hates regulation, but also like order. Order is good. Business abhors uncertainty. And so good order translated into common sense cost benefit regulation is not a bad thing.
So I'll give myself the final word before turning it back to Steve. So it is one of my job as a lawyer has always been, I was an M&A attorney for 25 years before I became a space lawyer. And I always saw my job as making life easier for my clients and getting my clients the licenses, getting what they needed. And so when I first started For All Mankind and shared this idea of protection, people immediately felt that I was sort of going to overregulate a company, or I was putting hurdles up for development and so forth. And that's not the truth at all. It's one way to get at that certainty that we want for investment. I love this idea. I think the one thing that I pulled out of this this session is the value proposition that Michael raises, and the fact that building an infrastructure on the moon, whether we protect the heritage sites or the whole moon, but the value of having exploitation on the moon is an infrastructure question, because it is going to build an economy. And that is something that's really important for all of humankind. And so I just want to now thank you, thank everybody who contributed through the chat. Really one of the most interesting chats I've been able to follow in a while. And thank my panelists, especially Bob, for your scenario, which I think I've been talking to Dr.
Well, Michelle, I know you were signing off there, and hopefully you'll get back on the call in a minute. But your timing could not have been better because we are at the end of our time. And Michelle, I hope you can hear me. You have done a fantastic job in putting this program together and running it expertly. And thanks to Michael, Chris, and Bob for an excellent series, excellent conversation on a topic which I think all of us, on here could tell it is a big topic. And I think just from my own observation, I think Bob's last comment was one of the best ones for me, which is, we are trying to husband something in space. We don't want an iron fist that's controlling what's going into, that's controlling the private sector. At the same time, there's going to be regulations. I think, Bob, you made a very good point that people are going, and I think Michael Mealing and others on the chat recognize the private sector is going into outer space. And I think similarly, you could say they're going to be regulated to some degree. I mean, there already exists a whole series of laws, international laws, that will be employed and accessed as we try to resolve issues as they come up. I think, Bob, you said it, but can we do better than what is already on the books? And I think that's ultimately what this whole conversation is about. I think it was Bob in an earlier conversation, and if it's not attributed to you, Bob, that's fine. But you said at one point in one of our earlier conversations that we need to put a call out there that the old rules that we have must be thrown out. That there's an opportunity here to come together and set a new template for the future and how we're going to engage commercially and as nation states as we begin to develop the resources of the solar system, and ultimately leading to human migration, human expansion into space, which is the mission of so many people that have chimed in here as well. Certainly is the mission of the Beyond Earth Institute. So with that, I will sign off here. We'll keep the conversation going. Thank you all. This has been recorded, and it will be available for download, and we will keep the conversation going in different ways with additional forums and additional ways to engage. So thank you all again. Thank you all participants. It's been a wonderful event. And by all means, have a very happy holiday.